This is another iRaw podcast.
Hello, I'm Emmy Leese, and welcome to the latest episode of Think Like a Vegan, a companion podcast to our book, also entitled Think Like a Vegan. Many books deal with the ethics between people and non-human animals. But none do what Josh Milburn's first book does. Josh's Just Fodder, The Ethics of Feeding Animals, explores a variety of questions, from who are we obliged to feed, who are we permitted to feed, what are we allowed to feed animals, to what is the role of the state in feeding animals, and how might obligations concerning the feeding of animals differ from obligations concerning the feeding of humans, and why? These are thought-provoking questions, and this book really pushed me to consider things in ways I just wasn't expecting. Today, I'm delighted to welcome to the podcast Dr. Josh Milburn. Josh is a moral and political philosopher interested in questions about human/animal relationships, food, liberal and libertarian political theory, and applied ethics. He's a lecturer in political philosophy at Loughborough University and a member of the Research Advisory Committee of the Vegan Society. Josh is also the host of the animal studies podcast, Knowing Animals, which is streaming on all platforms. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
Usually, at this point in the episode, I would read an excerpt from your book. I've tried, and it's impossible because the ideas and theories you propose are so complex and they need their space to be developed, which you do in each chapter. So instead, I believe it's more fitting here to briefly outline the structure of the book. So each chapter focuses on a different kind of relationship that people have with animals. Then you have the chapter 2, which focuses on those animals whose biology makes them carnivorous. Chapter 3 explores our relationship with companion animals. 4 considers animal neighbors, some of whom we feed, like birds, and some of whom we avoid feeding, like rats. Then chapter 5 focuses on those animals who want to eat the crops we grow for food for ourselves. 6 considers wild animals in need of aid. 7 looks to animal strangers. What, if anything, do we owe animals in the wild? And then you bring it all together in the final chapter with relatively practical conclusions to each of the problems you've presented. With that, Josh, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much. And I'm really glad that you've started with that introduction to the book as a whole, because what I'm aiming to do in the book is to think about the ethics of feeding animals and use that as a lens to think about the very different kinds of relationships that we have with animals. Because I think that lots of people thinking about animal ethics, philosophers, theologians, lawyers, they often think about what we owe to animals generally, or what we owe to animals as individuals, and what we owe to animals based on the kinds of capacities that they have. Can they suffer? Are they persons? But what I think is really important to do is also think about the kinds of relationships that we have with animals as individuals or as communities, and think about the difference that those relationships make. And what I thought it might be really interesting to do today is to think about one of the most important relationships we have with animals and how that shapes our feeding practices. And that's the relationship that we have with our companion animals. Now, the topic of feeding companion animals has vexed me for a little while. I noticed a few years ago that this is a topic that comes up frequently in vegan spaces, like vegan social media groups, and it often elicits real hostility. On the one hand, some people claim that there's a conflict between saying that you respect animals and then buying pieces of dead animal to feed to companions. On the other hand, some people claim that there's a tension between saying that you respect animals and then feeding them unexpected diets. Now, I use the word unexpected quite deliberately there. There's lots of different things that are claimed about plant-based diets for dogs and cats, that they're unnatural, that they're unsuitable, and so on. Now, this struck me as a clear example of an ethical dilemma in need of philosophical scrutiny, and that's what I've tried to offer in some of my work. Now, as you suggested just then, Just Fodder is about much more than just pet food and much more than just companion animals. But I admit it was questions about companion animals that first drew me into the question of feeding animals. But I realised that it stretched far beyond questions about pet food into thinking about wild animals, thinking about animals that are not quite wild, not quite domesticated, like garden birds. But sticking with companion animals or pets, let's start with the basics. Why should we worry about pet food at all? To be specific, I'm talking about what we can call slaughter-based pet food. That's pet food made with the meat of slaughtered vertebrate animals. And I use the term slaughter-based as I think it's important to distinguish slaughter-based meat from other kinds of meat, but I'll get to those other kinds of meat later. So when I say slaughter-based pet food, just know that I'm talking about the familiar dog and cat food that you can find in almost any shop selling pet supplies. The central worries we should have about slaughter-based pet food mirror the central worries that we should have about slaughter-based food for humans. And these, I think, will be familiar to lots of listeners, so I'll mention them only briefly. First, and quite obviously, in order to get meat for pet food, we need to do all kinds of awful things to animals. Farmers confine animals, they mutilate them, they send them to be killed at a fraction of their natural lifespan. And second, animal agriculture raises a host of environmental problems, including significant carbon emissions, pollution, deforestation, and all kinds of negative impacts on biodiversity. Third, animal agriculture comes with a host of public health risks, including those associated with environmental destruction, those associated with antibiotic use, and something that's now familiar to all of us, the threat of zoonoses, that is, diseases that jump from animals to humans. The crucial point to remember is that these concerns about harm to animals, environmental destruction, public health risks apply whether farmers are raising animals for human consumption or raising animals for pet food. Now, at this point, I can imagine that some people listening in might want to point out that there's an important difference between meat produced for human consumption and meat in pet food. And that is that slaughter-based pet food is frequently made with slaughter byproducts, the animals or parts of animals that humans don't want to eat. So some people have said to me, if animals are not being raised specifically to be made into pet food, we don't have a reason to worry about slaughter-based pet food from an ethical perspective. Now, I think this is a very important point, but I do think it's much too hasty to say that we shouldn't be worried because of it. First, some pet foods aren't based entirely or primarily on byproducts. And that includes, for example, lots of fish-based pet foods. Second, byproducts might become less available in time. For example, as I hope, if lots of people become vegan, or at the very least, if people become less wasteful in their meat eating, there may not be so many byproducts available. But third, and most importantly, whether or not pet food is made of byproducts, the pet food industry represents an important income stream for the slaughter-based meat industry, and this helps to make animal farming economically viable. And this industry, of course, is not one that we should be supporting. We should be withdrawing our support from it as far as possible. So if those are the problems with slaughter-based pet food, what's the alternative? Well, there are a few alternatives, and I'll get back to that later. But the big option, and the one that's proposed in the kind of social media debates I mentioned earlier, is that companion animals be fed a plant-based diet, be fed plant-based pet food. Now, companies have been making plant-based pet food for dogs and cats for decades, and there's a whole range of products on offer, and that includes dry foods, wet foods, foods for younger or older animals, food for animals with certain health conditions, treats, chews, supplements, and all the rest. Some people also prepare homemade plant-based pet foods, but it's important to stress that this comes with the challenge of ensuring that the food is complete and balanced. Buying a ready-made plant-based product that is already complete and balanced is a lot more straightforward. Now, a lot of people have had a great deal of success with these foods. So, to speak personally, my dogs Holly and Casper thrive on plant-based pet foods. We've tried a few different brands to see which ones they liked, and we buy them treats and chews from lots of different companies, but we currently feed them a complete and balanced dog food from the British brand Benevol. Now, given that these foods are available and given that lots of people have success with them, why is it that some people are so concerned about them? Well, let's start by acknowledging that plant-based pet foods may not be the most widely available or the cheapest pet foods on the market. And now this will, I hope, change in time, but I acknowledge that it presents a challenge at present. But I don't think it's for that reason that people are so vocally opposed to plant-based pet foods, including some vegans. Instead, they make a number of arguments which I think are worth disentangling and closely exploring. And this, in many ways, is the bread and butter of what I do as a philosopher. I disentangle arguments and then I interrogate them. So let's start with the first argument that people make. Some people object that there's something unnatural about feeding plant-based foods to companion animals. Now, these concerns are undoubtedly emotive, but I don't think they carry much ethical weight, and I don't think they withstand rational scrutiny. The critic of plant-based pet food needs to offer a conceptual explanation of what's unnatural about plant-based pet food, and they also need to offer a conceptual explanation of what's natural about a proposed alternative, like slaughter-based pet food. But crucially, they also have to offer a normative explanation of why unnaturalness is a bad thing. And I accept cats and dogs wouldn't naturally eat much soy, for example, and soy is a major ingredient in lots of plant-based pet food. But I add that they wouldn't naturally eat much beef or chicken either, and beef or chicken are common ingredients in slaughter-based pet food. Indeed, they wouldn't naturally eat food from cans or from bags or from supermarkets, and frankly, they wouldn't naturally exist. I suggest that there is no natural diet for companion animals. What matters is that the diets are healthy, are palatable, and that they don't unfairly impact others. And I think all of this illustrates how tricky it is to explain what's so bad about something being unnatural, which is one of the things that the person challenging plant-based pet food's unnaturalness needs to do. Lots of natural things are very bad. Disease, suffering, and starvation are all perfectly natural, and they're terrible. And lots of things we might want to call unnatural are very good. Universities, medicine, and podcasts are all presumably unnatural, but they're good things. So I don't think the unnaturalness challenge really gets us very far. So let's move on to a second concern that people raise about plant-based pet foods, and this one I think is a little bit more interesting. The challenge is often made that vegans who feed their companions a plant-based diet are forcing their views onto companion animals. Obviously, there's not actually a forcing of views here, there's just providing one food rather than another. Yes, the vegan guardian makes a decision on her companion's behalf, but all guardians do this. If we feed our companions anything, we've made a decision for them. So the challenge, presumably, is not that it's wrong to make decisions on behalf of companions, because we all do that. The challenge is that it's wrong to make this decision. So why would it be? Well, it could be because of claims about naturalness, which I just explored. It could be because of claims about health, which I discussed below. But I think that some of the rhetorical strength of the challenge is the idea that it's wrong to force companions to eat plant-based food because of the belief that companions themselves would choose differently if they could. Now, there are a few things to say about this. And the first is that it isn't actually clear that dogs and cats would choose otherwise. That might sound a very strange thing to say, but a recent study by Andrew Knight and Liam Satchell looked closely at the behaviour of over 4,000 companions at mealtime and found that there were very few apparent differences in palatability between slaughter-based and plant-based pet food based on the way that the animals reacted to the foods. This study suggests that it's far from clear that dogs and cats do prefer slaughter-based pet food, despite what we might expect. Now, of course, different dogs and cats do have different preferences. Dogs and cats are individuals. But people shouldn't be too quick to assume that their dog or cat doesn't like plant-based food. After all, there are lots of different plant-based pet foods on the market, and there are better or worse ways to introduce a dog or a cat to new food. Just because a dog or a cat didn't like this plant-based food doesn't mean that they won't like that one. But there's a second response I think we need to consider to claims about companions preferring slaughter-based food. A companion's own choice cannot be decisive. And if a companion's own choice cannot be decisive, that means it might be right to feed a companion plant-based food, even if they would prefer slaughter-based food. We already recognise that companions' choices can't be decisive when we take steps to not overfeed our companions, even if the companion herself would choose to eat treat after treat after treat if given the choice. And we recognise it when it comes to harm to another. We know that it would be a very irresponsible guardian of a dog who let their dog raid a stranger's picnic or maul a lamb in a field. But if it's right to restrict our companion's choice when our companion might choose to harm others, like in the lamb or picnic case, it could be right to restrict our companion's choice to eat meat, if that is what they would choose, which, again, we shouldn't be too quick to assume. After all, slaughter-based pet food is harmful to others for the reasons I've already explored. Now, I absolutely accept that it's important to respect our companions' choices, but we have to weigh that against the harm that some of the choices they might make could cause. What we should be aiming to do is allow companions' choices between ethically acceptable alternatives. For example, there's still lots of room for companions to make choices between different kinds of plant-based pet foods.
It's time for our musical interlude, and we'll return with more from Josh Milburn. This is another piece by Matthew Gerstenberger's Tokyo Recordings, and it's called Rin Rin, featuring 2 Buddhist instruments. The bell is a kanade ring, and you'll also hear a small wooden fish or frog instrument called the mokugyo. We're back for the second part of Josh Milburn's discussion on feeding animals.
We can now turn to what is, I think, the most important challenge to plant-based pet food. Lots of people worry quite reasonably that plant-based pet food will be unhealthy for their companions. Simply put, although plant-based diets are appropriate for humans, they might not be appropriate for other animals. After all, cats and dogs have very different biologies to humans, and indeed to each other. In my book Just Fodder, I introduce the idea of the problem of carnivory. While we can frequently attribute human non-veganism to ideologies, that might be ideologies that present humans as superior to animals, or animals as edible, or present the killing of animals as morally unproblematic or similar, we must frequently trace meat eating among animals to their biologies. Now, philosophers like me can challenge ideologies, but we're not well placed to challenge biologies. Ideologies change. Biologies typically don't. Dogs, like us, are omnivores, and this means that they've evolved to acquire nutrients from plant and animal sources. But cats are carnivores. Indeed, they're obligate carnivores. Insofar as the idea makes any sense for domestic cats, in nature, they'd eat an almost entirely meat-based diet. Now, again, we definitely shouldn't take what's natural as a guide for what's ethical, but maybe reflection on cats' supposedly natural diets will tell us something about what diets will be healthy for them. Now, it's very important for me to take a step back at this point. As I've said, I'm a philosopher. I'm interested in exploring ethical arguments. I'm not a veterinary nutritionist. And so, although I've read a lot of veterinary nutrition literature, I'm not someone who is qualified to make an all things considered judgment about the ways in which diets are healthy or unhealthy for cats, or indeed any animals. What I can do, however, is point to the kinds of arguments that we could make and the kinds of ideas that we could explore in response to this challenge about unhealth. First, we could challenge the idea that cats can't flourish on plant-based diets. Animals require particular nutrients, not particular ingredients, to be healthy. If we can derive these nutrients from non-animal sources, as producers of complete and balanced plant-based cat foods do, wouldn't that be healthy? Now, of course, we need evidence to answer that question. And only a small proportion of cats are currently fed a plant-based diet. A 2019 study by Sarah Dodd and colleagues found that only around 0.7% of cats are fed a plant-based diet, and indeed only a relatively small proportion of vegan guardians of cats feed their cats a plant-based diet. But overall, this still amounts to a large number of cats eating plant-based cat food, and there have been a small but growing number of studies showing cats thriving on plant-based diets. I'll be the first to admit, though, that there's room for more work on this. So what if these studies are pointing us in the wrong direction? That's naturally the next question that I think about. And this seems to be the worry of lots of people opposed to plant-based cat food. These studies, for some reason, are believed to be inadequate. So what if cats, or particular cats, or indeed some other companion, can't thrive on a plant-based diet? Well, it sounds like that introduces what philosophers call a tragic conflict. There are opposing moral claims pulling upon us, so it seems like whatever we do, someone will lose out. How can we resolve this? Well, the first thing to observe is that companion health isn't the only relevant consideration here. Maybe we're ethically obliged not to keep certain companions or to feed them diets that are not optimal for their health. Now, these might not sound like great results, they might not sound like great resolutions to the conflict, but they are ideas we should consider. But I do believe that there might be other ways to resolve the conflict. One way to go would be trying to favour supposedly humane sources of animal protein for companions. But I'm sceptical about this option if it still means supporting slaughter-based farming. Or maybe there are ways that we could source animal protein without contributing to support for slaughter-based animal agriculture, such as by acquiring but not paying for meat that would otherwise go to waste. That might be an ethical option, but it does start to sound very difficult and very complicated. I do believe, though, that there is a more satisfying solution on the horizon. A number of companies have started to explore an alternative to slaughter-based pet food, namely the possibility of cultivated pet food. This is pet food made with cultivated meat, which is also called in vitro meat or cultured meat or a number of other names. This is meat grown outside of animals. In principle, then, it offers the possibility of producing meat without farms, or with only very small farms, and crucially, without slaughter. Now, I certainly don't mean to say that cultivated meat raises no ethical issues, and this is something else that I spend a lot of time thinking and writing about in my work. But I do think, even if people are opposed to cultivated meat as food for humans, as some vegans are, there may be every reason to support the development of cultivated meat for pet food. Actually, the empirical evidence supports the idea that people do believe this. A recent paper I published with Alice Oven and Basha Yokson showed that there was much more support for cultivated pet food than cultivated meat for human food among vegans. And this, I think, is very encouraging. It shows that vegans recognise that there are real problems with slaughter-based pet food, even if they're not comfortable switching over to plant-based pet food right now. And this, I think, is an important point to end on. Because I don't think that questions about pet food, or for that matter human food, are solely questions for individuals. I think that these are collective questions, and we should collectively be striving for food systems which provide both humans and companion animals with good food, and do so in ways that are respectful of animals. So while my first book, which we've mentioned a few times, which is called Just Fodder, The Ethics of Feeding Animals, focused on questions about feeding animals, including, but not limited to, pet food and companion animals, My second book, which is called Food, Justice and Animals, Feeding the World Respectfully, asks these much broader questions about food systems. Of course, as I hope should by now be clear, these questions are very closely linked. I hope that's provided some food for thought.
Thank you, Josh. That was terrific, and I found your book. I mean, I have 2 cats, and so this problem, this issue, is one that I face all the time. I face it every day within myself, and I face it mostly with non-vegan friends who are saying, "Well, how do you reconcile this? Don't you think it's hypocritical and so on?" So these questions, they do in fact come up very often with especially with cats. And you referenced a study, I think by Sarah Dodd. Is that right? Yes. And I believe that then her study was used by the organization of pet food manufacturers here in the UK, which is called UK Pet Food. It used to be known as Pet Food Manufacturers Association. And they've produced a new fact sheet that talks about how plant-based foods are fine for dogs. And they are using Sarah's research and said it's probably also fine for cats, but we just don't have enough research on it, which I also think is really interesting. And it's something that you've said yourself. We just don't have that research yet. And it's almost like, well, why should we bother when actually we should very much be bothering, because lots of reasons. And from my personal experience, a personal anecdote, one of my cats eats a particular special diet for kidneys. So it's a renal diet. The biggest component of that is pea protein. When I was looking at the ingredients, I was like, wait, what? Hold on one second. And this is a regular brand of cat food that you can get anywhere. But I was really blown away when I saw that it contained primarily pea protein. So I was, in a way delighted as well, but also really surprised that we're still having the argument of, cat food can't be vegan, when in fact, it's already well on its way, at least in that particular instance.
Yeah, these are such fascinating issues. I think you're absolutely right about the more research angle. And this is part of the collective decision that I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Collectively, we should be pushing this onto the agenda, and we should be pushing for developments in this area, whether that's developing cultivated meat, whether that's developing new kinds of plant-based protein, or whether that's just better understanding of cat, dog, ferret biologies. And all of these things we could be doing collectively if we had the will. I think it's also interesting that you mentioned about the manufacturers organization, because these organizations are often quite conservative. And similarly, veterinary organizations are going through these arguments at the moment. And the Vet Times in the UK has had front page stories about plant-based pet food in the last year or so, in response especially to the work of Andrew Knight, who I also mentioned. And these organizations can be conservative, and these organizations often call for more research. But I think there's a lot of hostility among certain members of these organizations to the very idea. And I think often, actually, this hostility arises from confused philosophical ideas about, say, naturalness, about forcing opinions on companions, which, as I've suggested, don't really come to much, rather than the scientific questions about how healthy this is. So I think it's very important, alongside developing these scientific studies and developing scientific understanding, that we rigorously explore the perhaps less scientific side of this to understand why it is people are opposed and what reasons there might be to push back against that.
Exactly. And actually, this is the way I see it, it's the entire point of your book. Just Fodder, for me, as I was saying to you earlier before we started recording, was tough to read in certain aspects because it challenged my own biases, especially when you were talking about wild animals in sanctuaries and releasing carnivorous wild animals. Are we responsible for their victims, which would be victims in our minds? To them, it would just be food. Are we responsible for that? And And I bristled at first because I have my own biases. We all do. But I said, wait a second. Hold on, Emmy. Keep reading, because Josh has sat down and thought about this for a long time. So let's just read it. Let's see what he has to say. And those moments are the moments when you learn the most, when you really are challenged by something. And that's the thing. If we don't pose these questions, if we don't challenge our biases, how are we ever going to affect change, even on big picture things like companion animal foods? And I think that is what I really admired about your book. You push that, and you push for those questioning ourselves rather than just saying, well, it's always been like this. I inherently or innately or intuitively know X, Y, Z. And I think that is the real, it's a really valuable book for that. So I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks. I'm so glad you said that. And I think you're absolutely right about pushing ourselves, to challenging ourselves when we're faced with these things. And this actually speaks to one of the reasons that I thought it was worth writing a whole book about the feeding of animals, because that offers us a new way to think about old problems. It gives us a new perspective to think about these things and a new kind of framing of these problems. And so when you start to think about these things as problems of feeding, you might not think, oh, well, feeding is only one small part of rescuing a wild animal. But if you start to put that at the center, new questions arise and new possibilities arise. And I accept that these are often going to be controversial conclusions, and I welcome disagreement. If people read what I say and sincerely engage with it and say, well, actually, I don't agree with it for this reason, I'm completely open to that. What I'm hoping to do here is to start some conversations, or to move some conversations in some slightly different directions. There's always going to be disagreement when we're facing these particularly challenging questions. But I think if we are all motivated to try and make the world a slightly better place, even if we've got those disagreements, we can hopefully try and work through them.
Brilliantly put. Exactly. I completely agree. So before we go, where can people follow your work, whether online or otherwise? And do you have any projects you'd like to promote?
Well, people are very welcome to take a look at my website, which is josh-milburn.com, and you'll find links to all my published work on there, including versions of all my published papers. You should also, of course, think about asking your library to carry copies of my books, or finding a magazine or journal that might like to publish a review so you can get copies for free. I'm on social media. I'm on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, and I'm on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. I should also give a quick plug to Andrew Knight, who I mentioned earlier, and say if you're interested in more practical advice about switching companion animals towards plant-based diets, you can take a look at his website, or one of his websites, which is sustainablepetfood.info. And he's a vet, he's a professor, and he really knows his stuff. And I should also mention my podcast again, which is Knowing Animals. And Knowing Animals features interviews with animal studies scholars. There's a massive archive of episodes, all available for free, and new episodes are released every other week. Knowing Animals is on Twitter at knowing_animals, and on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn, and I'm on Instagram, if you want lots of pictures of my vegetables and flowers and things, at A Vegan Philosopher.
That's fantastic. Thank you again. I really appreciate you coming on today.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Emmy. It's been great fun.
Animal questions can be difficult and challenging. Engaging with our behavior towards animals is often one of the most uncomfortable struggles, because we must face our complicity with the harm towards others. And in that, I include animals and all people who are exploited, chased off their land, or live in areas polluted by animal agriculture. We seem to find reevaluating the moral identity we've created for ourselves more difficult than acknowledging factual harm, as if a ding to our moral identity trumps the suffering of others. And obviously, I don't believe that. Even if it is unpleasant to think about how we may be complicit in exploitation, sometimes that's unknowingly, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it or change our behavior when we learn new things. If we want a better world, we must engage and evolve. Next time, Tim Raiso joins us to discuss the concept of human privilege.
when we go round. We burn things up when we go round. We speed things up when we go round.
That's it from me, Emmy Leese. Thank you for listening. I'll post a transcript in due course on our website, thinklikeavegan.com. Remember, you can get in touch by email at thinklikeaveganbook@gmail.com or find Think Like a Vegan on social media. You can find me, more of my work and my upcoming events at emmysgoodeating.com and on social media. Subscribe to this podcast, share it with others, and leave us a review. And you can buy Think Like a Vegan anywhere you buy books and audiobooks or request it from your local library. Production credit goes to Jim Moore of Bloody Vegans Productions. Theme music provided by Jenny Moore's Mystic Business from the eponymous album. The opening tune is Flashback, and we close with Tear Things Up. The interval music is by Matthew Gerstenberger, aka Seismicity, on SoundCloud.
Things up when we go round. Things up when we go round. When around. Things up, we speed things up when we go round. We tear things up when we go round. We tear things up when we go round. Things up when we go round.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.